I'm Don McCormick. I've been writing poetry, short stories, and essays since 1980. I would have started sooner, but I wasted 20 years writing school papers and business documents. By 1980, I had some intrinsic motivations based on idealistic notions of love, hate, joy, and despair. I also had real life experiences in business and family that were very hard to understand and accept. So I began writing poetry and short stories. The collection is now about 800 pages. Books are easy to publish now, both electronically and on paper. My works are available in those forms. I decided to record my readings of the works in little bites in case people who don't like books can hear and be entertained by the poems, short stories, and essay. I ask your forgiveness in advance for my shortcomings in reading and acting. This is a very difficult poem for me. Chelva was a personal friend, a very beautiful woman. Chelva, happy. She makes me happy when she calls me on the phone. And when she greets me at the door, she's happy. And more, much more. Often I've thought, what if when Chelva laughed, the whole world behaved that way? All joy came, and all sadness passed away. I well up. I can hardly see to write. I think if Chelva did not laugh with us, no matter how bad the news, sadness would settle in, and joy we had would lose. If she'll just smile, I'll shed her tears. I'll explain to all who see her face that her courage and her laughter are the seams that bind the human race. This is for Chelva, an uncoupled elegy of the heart. When I first met her, she had a skin rash, cream-colored spots over her burnt sienna skin. The rash distracted me from her otherwise perfect complexion. At the time, I didn't know the meaning of the spots. I must confess, I would never have guessed anything could have been wrong with such a young and vibrant girl. But after a little conversation, I forgot she had the imperfections, because when she spoke, her words had an undertone of laughter. And when she listened to you, she understood. The longer you were with her, the more you wanted to hold her. That must have been her weakness. That must have been the reason he wanted her. And because he wanted her so much, she accepted him. And no one blamed him for what happened because it was love. For her, too, it was love. Open, gentle, passionate. He got the sickness first. It must have been very difficult because they both knew they had acquired the seeds of death. I don't know what they said or how they felt. Chelva never told me, and I never had a reason to ask. He died a few years before I met Chelva, and she was without his shadow. She was whole in the way of people who know the great litany of peace, mercy, and deliverance. I found out about her sickness after she was admitted to the hospital. We had a mutual friend who knew her much better than I did. He told me she had been HIV positive for several years, but had only recently gotten sick. And before sickness, she had been serving as a volunteer at the AIDS hospice in the hope that when her time came, the hospice volunteers would care for her too. She even had hope that she might not die, because she had cared for a stricken man and fallen in love with him, and he had recovered and was living at home again. And she was young and strong, and she believed in miracles, and I listened and I cried. I went to see her in the hospital, but I arrived after 10, and her mother met me in the hallway before I could reach her room. And she told me Chelva had already gone to sleep, and she told me not to worry because her baby would be out of the hospital soon. She was the mother, and she would see that Chelva recovered. I left a book of poems for Chelva in which I had written inside the cover that her friends knew her pain and loved her dearly. And her mother said she would give the book to Chelva, but later I asked Chelva about the book, and she told me her mother had never mentioned it. Her mother, she said, was strange and a little difficult. She didn't want Chelva to know about pain. Her mother always tried to protect her from frankness. She would not admit that Chelva was going to die. Chelva said that her mother was nuts, agreeably nuts, understandably nuts, but nuts nonetheless. So when Chelva's hour came, her mother insisted, contrary to Chelva's wishes, and contrary to the wishes of Chelva's friends, and contrary to the power of the courts, that Chelva, who was almost dead, who was heaving for her last breath, be moved from the hospice to the county hospital. 3 times her mother called the ambulance, and 3 times it came. And finally, even though the drivers knew she was nuts, even though they knew the hospital would not admit Chelva, they took her body and left it in the hallway of the county hospital. And her mother, who was nuts, and some strangers watched her die. This was contrary to Chelva's wishes and contrary to the wishes of her friends, but it was the right sense of the world for a young, beautiful black woman who didn't count for nothing in this world, who didn't even get her last wishes, whose body was delivered to the hallway of the county hospital. No one knew her but her friends, and like Chelva, her friends didn't count. They just had to watch. They just had to go on. And her good friend had to let it be, and he had to help her mother, who was nuts. The funeral came, and her family asked a preacher to read the service. And when it came time to preach, he said he had not known Chelva and he had nothing to say. And he wouldn't allow the boyfriend who had AIDS to speak. Instead, Chelva's grandmother spoke. And she said how hard she had worked to raise her children, but she said nothing about Chelva. And it was an odd last rite, and contrary to Chelva's life, like no one had known her, like she didn't count. Her friends who knew her are glad the world didn't know her. The world would have abused her more and left her in the hallway of the county hospital and said nothing about her at her funeral, and contrary to the wishes of her friends, forgot that she ever lived, except, of course, her mother, who was nuts, agreeably so, understandably so.